the early morning of December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, launching America into World War II. The United States military forces joined the Allies and began an aggressive offensive in both the Pacific and Europe. By land, air, and sea, American troops fought to preserve freedom and justice throughout the world. Though it was fought on foreign soil, the war affected all Americans. Hello, I'm Shannon Howard from Hoover High School in North Canton, Ohio. Today we honor our country's veterans by taking a look at one of our local heroes. Leland Kessler grew up in Canton, Ohio, attending McKinley High School, where he played football and was recognized as a talented artist by his teachers. Just a year out of high school, Kessler was at a friend's house listening to the radio when he heard the news about Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
11 days later, Kessler enlisted into the Air Force. He was 20 years old.
I was crazy about airplanes from the time I was a little kid, and I just had to be in the Air Force. I was the first one to run down there because I thought the war was going to be over in 6 months and I'd miss out.
Kessler started his training at Fort Hays in Columbus, Ohio, before going to Shepherd Field, Texas. He was then sent to Wendover, Utah.
It was the salt flats of the desert out there, and it was a godforsaken place.
After basic training and gunnery school, Kessler joined the newly formed 306 Bomber Group.
We were declared combat ready, which I don't think we were, but they needed planes very badly, and they needed somebody overseas. There was 4 squadrons. Each squadron got 1 airplane, B-17F models, Flying Fortresses and Liberators that had covers over the superchargers, because the English kept telling us, you'll never be able to fly daylight bombing, because they had tried it.
On September 10th, Kessler and his crew left Westover Field for Gander, Newfoundland, where they stopped to refuel.
We took off from Newfoundland that night, and 11:45, we had one engine catch on fire. 12:15, another engine caught on fire. We flew the whole night on 2 engines until daybreak. We ditched in the Irish Sea.
Kessler spent about 3 hours in the sea before being rescued.
I was scared to death. I'm totally frightened of water, and I kept thinking, you know, we're gonna go down, and I'm gonna drown. Really, I got to England with 4 broken ribs, a dime, and a pocket comb. That's what I had. We lost everything else, but we were saved.
While stationed in England, Kessler escaped the war when he could by painting and visiting museums. As squadron artist, he painted the nose art of 7 airplanes in his outfit, including his plane, the Eager Beaver. He also began flying missions.
The average life of a bomber crew at that time was 4 or 5 missions. There was either one of 2 things. You were either going to make it or you were going to be killed. Nobody ever thought anything about getting shot down, becoming a prisoner of war, or anything like that. The original crew that I had been on when I went down in the ocean going over had gone down somewhere over Ham, and they never found any of them. These guys you trained with, you flew with, you became like brothers. I couldn't have lost a brother or anything any more than I felt at that particular time.
In January 1943, the United States and Britain combined forces in a series of bombing raids to destroy major industrial areas of Germany. On May 21st, Kessler and his crew were assigned to a bombing raid over Wilhelmshaven, Germany.
The raid was pretty much a disaster. The weather was a cloud banks the whole way over. And when we popped out of there to make the bomb run, the Germans were up there waiting for us. One shell came through the nose and killed the bombardier and navigator. Another one came through the cockpit and hit the pilot in the shoulder. We knew that We were going down, and the third one was in the number 3 engine, and it was burning like a torch. The object was to get out of there. Coming down, the feeling is pretty hard to describe. You're going out at 25,000 feet. That's a long way down. You're going down into northern Germany, who was still winning the war. You had no chance of escape. I felt so alone. There's all the other planes are going back. It's a very lonely, lonely feeling. I came down right off the shore, the Bay of Wilhelmshaven. As soon as I got out of the water, I heard a couple shots, and I looked up, and there was a farmer up on a hillside who was taking pot shots at me. And a third shot just kicked up in front of me, and I thought, boy, he's got a beat on me. I'm not going to make it. And all of a sudden, I heard a couple pistol shots or lighter shots, and looked over, and here was 2 officers, German officers, and they were firing their pistols in the air. And this farmer took off. He ran. So they started hollering for me to come over there. And we went to the Wilhelmshaven Naval Base. And they took me in the naval base. I'm dripping water. I'm still all soaking wet. My flying boots is full of water. And they took me in front of in an office there with a big desk, and a guy sitting behind a desk, and on the desk was a nameplate, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz. Karl Donitz is the guy who signed the German surrender after Hitler killed himself. They asked me questions like how old I was and everything, which was a surprise to this admiral because being a tech sergeant in the German army, you had to be in there about 30 years before you ever become a sergeant. And they couldn't understand how a young guy like me was a sergeant, I guess. So they took me back to a room, and there was my radio operator and my tail gunner. And I thought that the radio operator was dying. He had broken his hip.
The remaining members of Kessler's crew were put in a boxcar on a train to Frankfurt. They arrived there around 10 p.m., just as the British Royal Air Force began bombing the freight yards at the station.
They locked us back in the boxcar. There was guys throwing up. It was terror. You're waiting for that next bomb to maybe hit your boxcar, and it's all over. I kept thinking of my mother, thinking, well, she's going to get a telegram, I'm no longer around or whatever, you know. Those are the things you think about.
After surviving the night, Kessler and the other men were taken to Dulag Luft.
We were put in a cell in solitary confinement, and was in a room. It was about 5 by 8 maybe, had a window higher than I could not get up to it to see out, and it was open all the time. Now while I was in there, for the 10 days, I got a cup of tea. It was a small cup of tea. It was sweet. And at that night, it was 3 boiled potatoes. And if you just eat a boiled potato with the skins on, you eat it like an apple. No butter, no salt, no pepper, no nothing. It's got a taste all by itself. In the meantime, you're counting the stones on the wall or the bricks. You think of anything that keep your mind occupied. I was stripped, completely naked. The point was it had taken your dignity away from you. Even though nobody's looking at you, maybe the guard would look in that door in a little peephole now and then to check on you. You lose everything. I mean, you no longer belong to anybody but them.
In addition to inadequate food and loss of freedom, Kessler often faced interrogation.
Lieutenant Kohler, never forget his name, a real nice fellow, steel gray hair, very fatherly type individual. He come in with another guy that I called him the weasel. He looked like a weasel. I don't know why. He had a nose that looked like an ice cream cone, glasses that sit out on the edge of his nose. And he had a suit satchel, a briefcase, and he was in a suit, and he was supposed to be from the International Red Cross. Well, he'd get out of form, and the big thing that I was concerned about, I knew where I was. I knew I was alive, and I wanted my parents to know the worst kind of a way that where I was and that I was alive, because I knew that they would be receiving a telegram saying missing in action. That's all they would know. Well, this is what the Germans used. In other words, they said, well, you answer these questions so that we can inform your parents. Well, you know what you're allowed to tell them. You can tell them your name, rank, and your serial number. Well, he would go down the line asking these questions. All of a sudden it would come, what is your bomb load? Well, that was the key right there. What did the International Red Cross care about what a bomb load was? Well, he'd get mad and pound the table and say, well, we can't tell your parents or anything because you won't answer these questions and everything. He'd pack everything up and leave.
On Kessler's last day at Dulag Luft, a German officer came into his cell with a scrapbook of news clippings. Kessler was stunned by what he saw.
He finally came to a page with me. He had the same things out of the Canton repository that I have in my scrapbook now at home. To me, I thought, if they know all about a little guy like me who is nobody, we can't win this war. And that was probably the thing that I never felt lower. I just gave up. I felt at that time that I was going to be there forever, and that was it. And I said to him, sir, you know as much about me as I know about myself. And he just smiled and said, oh, I just wanted you to know. Folded the thing up, and when he went to the door, he stopped at the door and he took back and he says, well, by the way, Sergeant, congratulations on your getting the Distinguished Flying Cross. This was 1943, May of 1943. My parents received the Distinguished Flying Cross in 1944 at a ceremony at the American Legion. He knew it before I did.
After 10 days in solitary confinement, Kessler was shipped to Stalag 7A, a prisoner of war camp in Moosburg, Germany. He spent 8 months there before being sent to Stalag 17B in Krems, Austria, where he spent the rest of the war. Each day was a challenge in a prisoner of war camp.
We try to goof up the Germans. The big thing was to keep them occupied, to keep as many guards guarding you so that they couldn't send them to the front. That was our way of fighting a war. And people think, well, you were in a prison camp, you didn't have. We had our own war. Our war was disease, loneliness, hunger.
The conditions at the prison camp were difficult and oftentimes unbearable.
We got soup. It was watered down soup. And any horses that was killed in an air raid, that's the meat we got. And the French run the kitchens, and they used to put the head of a horse on there. We found out how they did it. They split it down there and throw in one vat and throw another. Well, you're liable to get an eyeball, a tooth. Anything that you got that you didn't understand what it was considered foreign matter.
As the months dragged on, prisoners attempted to keep physically and mentally active by walking around the compound, keeping the guards occupied, and planning elaborate escapes. Still, the harsh conditions caused many of the men to commit suicide, or as the prisoners called it, hit the wall. Kessler, however, never considered killing himself.
I had too much hope.
In February 1945, as the Allies advanced on Germany, Hitler ordered all prisoners of war to be executed. Because of a crude radio that the men had made for themselves, they had some idea of what was going on outside their camp. But soon, they would see for themselves as Stalag 17B was evacuated when the Russians began to invade Germany. The prisoners were forced to begin marching to Mauthausen concentration camp, though they didn't know it at the time. Kessler was asked to carry the American flag.
Before we took off, I was asked, would I carry the flag? And I didn't understand this. Now, we had received a flag from from the Red Cross, and we were not allowed to fly it. We were not allowed to display it in any way at all, but we were allowed to drape the caskets of somebody, the guys that got shot or died of dysentery or pneumonia or whatever, however they died. The Germans did recognize funerals. I mean, so we would drape the casket and all of us would stand and salute as they go by and were buried in Boot Hill. But that's the only time I'd ever seen this flag. So when I was asked to carry it, I agreed that I would carry it, but I asked why. And they said, well, by this time, our Air Force, our fighter planes, was controlling the sky. And they were shooting up everything. And if we got caught out in the road and they would think that we were a troop movement, we'd get blowed off the road. We were going to be killed. Whenever we heard an aircraft or an airplane, why they'd holler flag. You know, my job was to run out and spread this flag out on the road where it could be seen from the air. And the planes would swoop down and they'd take a look at this and they'll back up and swoop, and we'd all cheer like at a football game or whatever.
During the march, the prisoners had to survive hunger, fatigue, and illness, as well as the climate.
The weather in March was just like it is around here. It rained, it snowed, then you'd have a nice day. And I'm carrying this flag and it got soaking wet, and that flag got heavy. I tried to pass it off, nobody would take it, so I continued with it. Well, I use it at night for a pillow. You lay down in a field, right wherever they stop you. Maybe you wake up with snow on you in the morning. Well, I decided this flag, I might as well use it for a blanket. And this flag became very dirty, muddy, and everything else. It had a special meaning to me. It was used for funerals, which was death to start with, and now was used to save our lives.
Ending the march at Mauthausen would have meant certain death for Kessler and his comrades. Although the details are not clear, the German guards marched the men past the gates of the concentration camp. After the war, Kessler learned one possible reason why.
Mauthausen had such a backup of cremating the bodies that they built freezer rooms to keep the bodies in because they were behind in their count. Can you imagine this? I mean, here's a country losing the war, and that's how dedicated they were to get rid of all of these Jewish people and political prisoners and whatever was in the concentration camps.
After passing Mauthausen, the prisoners spent 2 weeks in a forest by the Ince and Salzach rivers before they were liberated on May 5, 1945, by General Patton's 3rd Armored Tank Division. They were flown to Nancy, France, where they got much-needed food and clean clothes. Before they could shower, however, they had to remove all their dirty, infested clothing to be burned.
And he says, but that flag's got to go on there too, it's material. And I said, no, I'm being bullheaded. I said, I carried this halfway across Germany, I'm not gonna throw it on there. I was just being bullheaded. So he said, well, we'll see about that. And he took off to get an officer, I guess. And here, one of our guys was coming out of the showers, and I run over and I said, hang on to this for me, and he did. For 80 years, I'll still respect the flag and know what it means, at least to me, and what I think it means to the country.
That flag is now displayed at the Prisoner of War Museum in Andersonville, Georgia. After the war, Kessler attended college, married Peg Kuntz, and raised 3 children. He worked at the Timken and Hoover companies and retired from Canton City schools. He has lent his time and artistic talent to the Military Aviation Preservation Society, known as the MAPS Museum, located near Canton, Ohio. Throughout his life, his passion for art has remained. 1974, Kessler was back in the hospital with heart problems. When the hospital served boiled potatoes one night, memories of the war began flooding back. He told his nurse about a picture that he had started immediately after he had returned from the war. He had never finished the drawing because he didn't feel that anyone would understand it. The nurse convinced him to finish it, so Kessler had his wife bring his pen and inks and the layout he had started after the war to the hospital. Still, he didn't share the drawing with anyone until 1986, when he heard another POW, Edward Allen, talk about the same experience in a television interview at a POW convention in Cleveland. The next day, Kessler shared his picture with Allen on the Cleveland talk show, The Morning Exchange. This gave Kessler an opportunity to begin sharing the memories that have haunted him since that day in 1945.
Going past Mauthausen, there was a group of these concentration camp guys, Hungarian Jews, who was working at a quarry. They were coming up the road, and this SS was leading them, and we would hear shots, knew what was actually happening because these guys were walking skeletons. If they fell over and was dying there, well, the guy would just stick a bullet in them, and that was it. But just as they got alongside of us, they stopped us. And this one fellow just fell over and was too weak to even get up. And we saw a display there, and I normally don't tell this. That guard took the gun butt and started beating him with that, and there was nothing but like taking a pumpkin and smashing it. We went on from there, and as we were passing another group coming, we seen the bodies laying along the side of the road. And we come to this one body. I was in the back of the column. And this guy was laying there, and he had a crinkled photograph by his hand. It was probably the only possession he had. I don't know why I wanted that photograph, but I stepped out of line. I was going to pick it up. And I heard a guard holler, and I looked back, and he's taking the gun off his shoulder, and I thought, there's no use of me getting shot or killed for somebody I don't even know. But I got to look at the picture, and it was a woman and two children. Now, it was probably his wife and two children. Where they were, I don't know. They may have been dead. They may have been in another concentration camp. But here was a guy that died alongside the road. He knew he was dying, evidently, pulled a picture out, kissed it. At the same time, the guard shot him through the head. I figured that everybody had the right to die with dignity. And here was a guy that was nothing. He was only a number.
Kessler's drawing has been reproduced all over the world and hangs in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., the Yad Vashem in Tel Aviv, Israel, as well as a museum memorial at Mauthausen. Since 1986, Kessler has also shared his story with numerous community organizations and schools.
I feel very fortunate. I think I'm one of the luckiest persons in the world. I survived 4 aircraft that was destroyed. I survived a prison camp. I have nothing but admiration and hope because you guys are the future. You're the people that guys like me depend on.
Lee Kessler is just one of more than 16 million soldiers, sailors, and aviators who fought for freedom and democracy in World War II. Through his artwork, he has ensured that the sacrifices of those lives lost, both military and civilian, will never be forgotten.